Certainly glad to be here. Appreciate the invitation. I did this, what was it, 2 years ago?
That was a year ago.
Just a year ago?
Every fall, yeah.
Okay,
That's
so that's, time moves by at a strange pace when you're in the General Assembly. You have 5 months that are incredibly intense from January to May, where you're doing about 16 hours a day, roughly, in one capacity or another, trying to either do the official legislative side of it, or you're trying to gather the information, develop the relationships that you need to be effective. And then the rest of the year, you're engaged in constituent services. A lot of members have jobs that they work in addition to being a member of the General Assembly, and they primarily do those through the June through December months when there's no official legislative business going on. Now, I would hasten to add that even though there's no official legislative business going on, there are still field committee hearings that will occasionally occur. We still have a veto override, which is also 2/3 here in the state, just as it is at the federal level of both chambers. And you still have a lot of political events that's going on. A lot of those are optional, but if you really want to be effective, you have to be in the community. You have to attend a lot of events where people who are interested in politics and who want access to the representative are able to have that. So I don't know exactly what my mandate is here today. I guess I'd be happy to give you a brief overview of how the legislative process works, if that would be
Yeah,
of
well, I'd
interest.
add what your job consists of, and then later there'll be one other thing you can address before we start going to questions.
Well, the job is really up to the representative. I mean, your responsibilities are between you and the people who elect you. So, you know, the shorthand is that, as they say, well, the only thing that you have to do is go in and vote, because and really that's the only thing that you can do that an average citizen can't do is vote on the floor of the General Assembly. But strictly speaking, you don't even have to do that. There's no penalty if you don't. There's no one forcing you to do it. Only the people who elect you are going to hold you accountable, depending on your job performance and what they want to see in your job performance. I know we have members of the General Assembly who vote no on every single bill, almost without exception, that comes to the floor, and they are reelected every 2 years, and that is what the public who elects them wants to see them do, is to protest what they see as the direction of government. There are others who take almost the opposite track of that. They vote yes on almost every single thing that goes through, and then there are plenty of folks who are in between. So the job as it exists on a day-to-day level during session is to be present for the proceedings of the House, to be present for the committees that you're assigned to. In my case, I'm the chair of an appropriations committee, which is new from the last time I was here. So there are a lot of duties that revolve around chairing a committee, preparing for the work of the committee, gathering the information, overseeing whatever legislation is going to be brought before the committee, and when it's an approps committee, you're dealing with the budget. I also sit on the full budget committee. So there's a lot of work that goes into figuring out, what the government is spending now, what is the effectiveness of the money that's being spent, and given the limited amount of resources that we have available, do we want to make any changes to the priority in the way that we're spending the taxpayer money? And that's a very intense process, even above and beyond the normal legislative experience. If you're a member of the budget committee, you're probably going to be coming into committee at 8:30 every day, and you're probably going to be in that committee listening to testimony, looking through documentation about the budget until 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night, with a few breaks to go up to the floor to do the regular business of the House, or maybe to go to another committee. And that's much different than most of the committees that people sit on. Most of them are, have an hour or two hearing once or twice a week, and they're very policy driven. So you're just looking at individual legislative proposals that have been introduced by other members. The other thing, I guess, in addition to voting, the other thing that a legislator can do is they can actually introduce bills. And there's a window which you have to introduce bills. We start early filing in December, and we can file bills through March, and through the 1st of March, and then after that time, bill filing has ceased, and we just consider whatever bills have already been filed. Now, if there needs to be new policy bills generated after the timeline for members to introduce, committees also have a way to introduce bills, and then of course you can put any kind of policy on a bill that's amendable without that policy having been previously introduced as a standalone bill. The pace, I guess, of the legislature increases all throughout session. So the early part of the legislature, there's very little floor activity. It's almost all committee activity because you're trying to generate the legislation that will be considered by the full chamber. And you're trying to vet it, you're trying to improve it, to find any problems that might exist with it, to repair it. And then toward the end of the session, committee work drops off because anything that's in committee late in the session is probably not going to have any chance of going anywhere. Just because of the amount of time it takes to move a bill through the process. And instead you're on the floor almost all the time, engaging in floor work, considering the bills that are advanced in the process and whether or not they're going to be able to finally pass and go to the governor's office. The governor and the Senate, from a House perspective, are always involved in the process. Like you always try to be cognizant of what they want to do and what their position is on a bill. I mean, the last thing you want to do is invest a lot of time and effort and energy in a bill all session long, send it to the governor's office and have it vetoed. Or, spend a lot of time and energy on a bill in the House and send it to the Senate and have it just immediately die. So you're always engaging in conversations, and that's the part of the process that is left out of the textbooks. I mean, you can read the legislative process in your textbook and know the steps that a bill has to go through. But what an academic setting can't capture is the relationships and the personalities and the behind-the-scenes negotiations that have to go on in order to have a bill go through the process, and the sheer number of people who are involved in that. I think the stereotype or the perception in the public is that there's just a room full of folks and they get together and decide what they're going to do, and then the rest of us have to live with it. But in reality, what's going on is you're having advocates from around the state, individuals like yourselves, groups who advocate on specific issues, people from an affected industry who are going to have to live under the law more directly because it affects the area of their livelihood or the area of their interest in some way. And all these folks are in the room too, talking and sharing their perspective and trying to influence the outcome of a particular bill. Some of those folks do that because they're passionate about it and because they believe in what they're doing. Some of them do it because they have been hired to come there and advocate, just like you would hire an attorney to advocate for you in a court of law. Some folks will hire advocates to come and try to shape the outcome of legislation. So there's a very large process that takes place. There's a lot of different viewpoints that are always taken into account. And typically, I like to say I've probably never voted on a bill that I agree with 100% or voted against a bill that I disagree with 100%, because it's always going to be the product of a negotiation, and that negotiation is always going to be the product of a broader societal conversation.
So a couple questions. First
Yes.
of all, what got you into your profession now?
Well, I suppose it's a mixture of personal interest, professional interest, and opportunity. I mean, just because you're interested in being in politics doesn't mean that you're going to be able to win a seat. Just because you have the ability to win a seat doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be interested in going out and doing that. I've had the interest in public policy for a long time. I think it's an important part of our society. I think it's something that people who have the inclination and the ability to be involved should be. But I also recognize that it's a sacrifice. I mean, that you have to take time away from your family, you have to take time away from your career, and that isn't something that a lot of people want to do necessarily, and there's nothing wrong with that. The whole point of having a representative form of government is that we select someone from amongst ourselves and we send them there to advocate on our behalf as citizens of the district that we live in, and who we decide that person should be. There's going to be a lot of people in any given district who would be capable of doing that. There's going to be a smaller number of people who are both capable and interested. So,
why do you identify with the Republican Party and not some other political party?
well, so that's a very complicated question. The Republican Party, I think, by and large, has more of the policy viewpoints that I agree with. Although, again, just like with legislation, you never agree 100% with your own party or disagree 100% with any other party. At least I don't find that to be the case with anyone that I have engaged with in political discussions. I am a traditionalist in that I believe that, as we think about public policy and we think about government, we should look to the past to see what has worked before and what lessons we can learn from what has happened in prior experiments, both in our country and around the world. I think we should look to the accumulated wisdom of people who have thought about politics down through history, the philosophers, the political scientists who have put a great deal of effort and have critiqued other systems of government. And I think that kind of approach is most at home in the Republican Party today. And so that's why I have traditionally affiliated as a Republican all my life.
Thank you for introducing yourself. At this moment, we have 100 questions for you, not just this
Sure.
class, but all the other classes as well, on anything under the sun. So
Yeah.
if anybody has any questions that jump to mind, please, anything you've maybe written down or anything that may come to mind, give it to us right now.
Yes.
You ever think about going farther up?
Well, I mean, certainly we have term limits here in Missouri, so I'm about halfway through the amount of time that I can constitutionally serve as a representative. You get 8 years, which is 4 terms, and I'm in my second term right now, halfway through my second term. So if the people choose to send me back, I'll have 2 more terms as a representative. The state senate is similarly term limited. Kind of a natural progression for someone who's a representative is to go to the Senate afterwards if that opportunity exists. And indeed, the former representative whose seat that I replaced, who had the 133rd district before me, is currently your senator for the same area. So it would make sense. I mean, certainly anyone who I think is in electoral politics thinks about that. But I'm not making any announcements or commitments here. I think also you have to look at where you're at in your life, and you have to look at whether or not the people have agreed with the job that you've done and what kind of support you have in the community. And the main thing, I mean, I have the job that I want right now, and the main thing I'm worried about is executing the duties that have been assigned to me in a way that the public thinks that I've done a good job and appreciates the job that I've done. That's my main concern. And anything else that might come afterwards will be for another day.
So here's a question from another class. This one's from Shannon Bickle, a great question. And she read your website, as most folks did, for your visit. While opposing the Washington health insurance mandate, I'm quoting her, you claim Missouri can have the freest healthcare system in the market. Can you elaborate on that theory and how you will personally be working towards that goal?
So the state has a lot of regulatory constraints on the health insurance market, and I mean this is a problem that we've had in states around the country. You have all these different requirements for a health insurance program. I think that the best way to handle healthcare is kind of like you'd handle cell phones or computers or any other market consumable. You allow the providers to offer a wide panoply of services, and you allow the consumers to decide which one of those services that they wish to consume. And you don't require people to purchase things that they otherwise wouldn't want to purchase, whether that is a plan or whether that is a certain kind of procedure or a certain kind of coverage. I think that it's more economically efficient, it's more cost efficient to let the consumer and the provider hash those details out for themselves.
A question from Ashlyn Collins. She says, you believe people should be able to exercise their Second Amendment right. Do you think gun laws need to be changed to prevent tragic events such as Odessa, Las Vegas, Sandy Hook, and so many others from happening?
Well, that's an interesting premise to the question. I think that if you look around the world at the experiences that other countries have had with gun regulations, you see some countries that have a very low degree of gun regulations and a very low amount of gun crime. You see other countries that have a high degree of gun regulation and a high degree of gun crime, and you see everything in between. Brazil is a good example of a country that has historically had a very high gun crime environment, but has also had, at least until very recently, has had almost a total ban on guns, as near as I can tell, in their federal laws and their national laws down there. The relationship between American citizens and firearms is really one that goes to the question of self-defense. Do you have a right to defend your life and the life of your family against hostile actions by other people, or do you not have that right? Do you have to rely entirely on the state to provide defense of your life and your family? Historically, in our country, we have always fallen down on the side of the individual has that right of self-defense. And it's an ancient right. It's a right that goes back probably further than this, but at least in my knowledge, as far back as the Roman Empire, which had a saying which roughly translated from Latin, said something to the effect that when arms are raised, law is silent. Because it was recognized that when someone met you with deadly force, you didn't have time for the magistrate and the state to arrive and to defend you. You needed to be able to do that in the moment that occurred at that time. So I think in this conversation, we have to look at what the purpose of the Second Amendment is and the accompanying amendment in the Missouri Constitution. This is also, as an aside, something that most people don't know. The Missouri Constitution is actually more protective of firearms than the federal Constitution. The Missouri Constitution protects ammunition, accessories, and things like that, not just the ability to have a gun. But we have to think about this in the societal purpose for firearms, and I think we need to have a societal consensus when we decide what to do. This is not a question that should be left up to legislators. This is a question that can only be decided by the American people, who, if they want a change, are going to have to do that through a constitutional amendment to the founding laws of this country. And I'll certainly be happy to live with whatever the American people want to do, although I will say, and I think this is obvious from my website and from things I've always said, I firmly believe in the right to self-defense. I firmly believe that people should be able to protect themselves and should be able to carry a firearm of their choice in order to do it. Yes?
Just to bounce off of that, so how does the Missouri Congress plan to protect public schools in Missouri from these gunfire from school shootings?
Well, there's a variety of ways that you can do that, and I think it depends on what the threat is. Is the threat that we're trying to defend against students bringing guns to school and shooting people? Is the threat an external actor, a third party who's not a student coming to the school and engaging in violence? Depending on the source of the problem, I think that the solution has to be different. Some schools have tried metal detectors at the doors to try to make sure that no one is bringing a firearm into the premises. Some schools have tried, armed resource officers who are there to respond in a moment's notice if anything occurs. But I think that those are trying to address the symptoms of the problem and not the core of the problem itself. Our society was not always one in which the threat of gun violence was as present as it is today. At least my perception is that violence of all types has increased down through the decades. And I think we should ask ourselves why that has occurred, why we have this increasing sense of insecurity, what has changed in our culture that has allowed that, and try to address those questions. We can look at how to address symptoms and run ourselves ragged trying to come up with ad hoc solutions to the symptoms of the problem, or we can try to identify what has changed, what the core of the problem is, and address that. And I don't know if there's any easy answer there.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up. What has led to this change?
There's been a lot of changes in our society, down through the decades, and probably depending on what your view is on those changes and your view on whether or not they've been positive, that's probably going to instruct in some way your speculation as to what the problem is. I don't know that anyone actually knows at this point what has caused the problem or how we get back to a solution to it. But what I do think is that when we're talking about how we address the symptoms of the problem, that's a conversation that is not ever going to get us to a final, to an actual solution. And that's the way I think we work on a lot of different issues in our country. We look at the symptoms of a problem and we make very little attempt to get to the underlying causes of the problem.
Let me read you another question. This one is a great one from Brianna Brand. In the pro-life movement, as you yourself are pro-life, and this is from Brianna, are there any ways a woman can get an abortion if it is actually needed? And in parentheses, she says life-threatening to the mother, or baby, rape, etc.
The answer is yes. The availability of an abortion, even when those factors are not present, is currently possible in the state of Missouri. Is the question more what I think the final policy should be, or what the policy is now?
That was her phrasing.
Okay.
Let's. I do want to couch that question in this other one, because right now a federal court has temporarily shut down what's called a heartbeat bill. Can you explain what that is and how you feel about it and what's going on right now?
Well, so the heartbeat bill, I believe, is an 8-week restriction on abortion. Essentially, whenever the child begins to develop a heartbeat, that would be the cutoff point for an abortion. The court, of course, has put an injunction on that, and an injunction on several other components of the bill, as House Bill 126 that passed this year. And of course, it's pending litigation to the Supreme Court, which is the only court that can make changes to Roe versus Wade and its series of cases that have broadly created the contours for abortion law in the country. What was the second part of the question?
How do you feel about this heartbeat bill?
Sure.
And what's the future of it? It's held up in court right now.
Well, I'm 100% pro-life, personally, and I believe our laws should reflect that in this country. But I'm also a federalist. I believe that states should be able to craft laws that are suitable for the people in that state. And so I don't think that we should have one uniform federal standard that gets applied to all the states. I think that the contours of that law, just like any other area of policy, should be a conversation that is had by the people of the state who are going to have to live under that law, and that they should be able to create a policy that works for their communities and their culture and their state. But personally, and I think as what I would advocate for in Missouri law, I think we should be 100% pro-life.
A question from Skylar Mesachek. What is your current view on the trade war between the Trump administration and China, and how it is affecting Missourians?
Well, there's certainly concern about the trade war because we do a lot of exporting to China. We have a very strong agricultural industry in this state, and so we have a lot of products that we export into foreign markets in the foodstuff industry, commodities industry. And anytime you have a disruption of trade in those areas, you're going to have potential for economic disruption in Missouri. And that's the short-term immediate consequence. In the slightly longer term, the medium to long term, I think there's a definite sense amongst the American people, and certainly in the Trump administration, that the trade deals that we have negotiated with other countries have been disadvantageous to our domestic industries and domestic workers, and that we should reconsider the contours of those trade agreements. Other countries, China probably being one of the forefront of this problem, very disrespectful of our intellectual property. We have a lot of intellectual property theft that goes on between our companies and other countries. We have problems with access to markets in other countries. And again, I'm not trying to pick on China. There are other countries that engage in these practices as well. But American consumers will take products that come from other countries, but when we attempt to sell our products back into those same countries, there are all kinds of regulations and restrictions that have the net effect of preventing us from having a fair, competitive competition with the domestic products in that country. And I don't necessarily begrudge those countries the ability to engage in those kind of practices, to do what they think they need to do to protect their citizenry, but we should not be afraid to do those things either, and make sure that we are protecting the interests of the American people in these kind of trade engagements. Now, I think that's only one part of the conversation. The state of our trade policy, it certainly has a big economic impact. It also has an impact on wages for workers, which is something I think we should all be concerned about. And the other component of that is immigration, and how available or how easy it is for labor to cross international borders. So back in the early 90s, the way that companies tapped into lower cost labor was to send the business, send the manufacturing, send whatever it was overseas into low wage markets. And at the time it was primarily China, also countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, countries that had very low wages. They would send the labor component of the manufacturing process to those countries, and that would drive down wages for workers here at home by creating artificial levels of unemployment. In the late 80s and mid 90s, you started to see free labor competition occurring across our own border with seasonal migratory workers, with heightened levels of legal immigration, and increasing large amounts of illegal immigration, which is particularly unfair to workers here in America, because an illegal immigrant worker is very vulnerable to exploitation, to being paid a wage that is illegal, to being put in working conditions that might be illegal for American citizens, and they have no recourse when that happens to them. Because if they try to approach the authorities, if they try to speak out, they'll simply be deported or replaced by another worker. So I think all of that needs to be part of the conversation on how we think about our foreign trade, and how we think about how we're going to improve the working conditions and wages for American workers. Yes?
Do you think that within Missouri, or I guess within any state, the lack of sexual education within public schools is the reason why we're seeing such an increase in teenage unwanted pregnancy and the growth of young STDs spreading throughout the youth?
Well, I'm not sure that I can say that there's a causal relationship there, because again, we have a situation where a lot of factors have changed, and I think it's a multitude of factors that have probably contributed to those kind of statistics. I mean, certainly the problem that exists now is much different and more severe than the problem that would have existed 50 or 75 years ago. But I don't think the schools had intensive sex education 75 years ago and stopped doing it. So there have been other changes that explain that. Now, whether or not that can be part of the solution to the problem, I think is another question. But I think that we can't lose sight of an underlying principle that I think should always govern the education of a child, which is A, the best interest of the child, and B, what are the wishes of the parents and the family. And so, you know, if we look to solutions like that and make those available, I think we also want to be careful and make sure that we don't step on the rights of parents to oversee the upbringing of their children the way that they wish to.
I would love to get to this question in a moment, but this is just too relevant since we're talking about what's in our schools. This is a question from Ruthie Lone. Seeing that your faith has played a role in your practice, where do you stand on the separation of church and state in our school system? The Trump administration, as you probably know, is talking about asking schools teaching Bible classes. What's your opinion on that?
Well, so the separation of church and state arises from a letter to the Danbury Baptists that was written by Thomas Jefferson in the early days of our republic. And the thrust of that letter, the thrust of what President Jefferson was trying to get at when he was writing this letter, was not that he was concerned that religious influences would corrupt the state, but rather concerned that the state would corrupt our religious institutions. And so that there needed to be some degree of separation there to make sure that the influence of the state did not have a deleterious effect on the church. It's also interesting to note that historically, many states had taxpayer-funded established religions until the early 1800s. So whatever the phrase separation of church and state has come to mean today, the president that wrote that phrase, I think, would have had a very different understanding of what that phrase means. But that can't necessarily be the only factor that influences how we think about this issue, because our society has changed, and I think the relationship of the people to their government has changed down through the years, and people demand a different kind of thought process when it comes to issues like that. I think that, again, this goes back to what I said earlier. You know, parents have the right to bring up their children as they see fit. And so the schools and the government should have a minimal amount of concern about what the citizenry thinks, what students think. The job of the